Welcome back to If I Knew You Better. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and I'm always glad to have you join me here, and I'm especially glad that you tuned in today because my guest today is Michael Wiese. Now, in the film and TV business, he actually needs no introduction, but let me tell you a little bit about who Michael is. Among other things, he is an artist, a filmmaker, and a former Hollywood executive, but he is probably most well known to most people as a book publisher. He is the founder of Michael Wiese Productions, and they are behind many of the classic film and TV textbooks, as well as modern classics like Save the Cat. I've interviewed several of his authors, which has been a real treat for me. These are the kind of folks I've been excited to talk to because they're authors who also work in film and TV, but they often came to that from some other sort of an artistic background, or in some cases, a really fascinating entrepreneurial background. And so there's some really rich stories there. And I'm just going to come right out and say this. It's obvious in the interview. I'm a bit of a fanboy for these guys, and I especially love their approach and the philosophy behind their work and this company, the way that they have built this. And I want to quote you their mission statement. This is from the back of Michael's autobiography, Onward and Upward, which we talk about a bit in the interview. But this is the mission statement in all of their books, and it's fairly mythologically impactful. So let me share this. It says, "In a dark time, a light bringer came along, leading the curious and the frustrated to clarity and empowerment. It took the well-guarded secrets out of the hands of the few and made them available to all. It spread a spirit of openness and creative freedom and built a storehouse of knowledge dedicated to the betterment of the arts." And I think this is a wonderful way to put this. They are really focused on this idea of conscious media and trying to share knowledge and trying to empower people, as they say in here, to be their best. And so for me, I would say that he's also a bit of a philosopher, to say the least. But in Michael's words, he is simply an enabler of others to do or be their best. He moved to Cornwall, England several years back, and we connected on Skype to have this chat. There are a few occasional Skype gremlins, but we worked it out with a few tweaks. Now, we recorded this on his birthday, which is always special for someone, and especially because he shares this same birth date with his old friend Bucky Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller, we talk about this a lot in the interview, is someone whose work also had a big impact on my formative brain and is still someone who influences my thinking sometimes. So Bucky Fuller shows up in spirit in this conversation, and especially considering the weight of this occasion, I was really inspired to do my best with the talk. I think you can hear that I'm a bit nervous at the beginning of this as we get going, but Michael put me at ease and the conversation really opened up as we kind of moved along. Now, as I said, his book, Onward and Upward, was the framework for the chat. That is linked in the show notes. But we ranged far and wide, and occasionally what some people would consider pretty weird, but those are my favorite parts, and my kind of people are probably going to enjoy those the most too. Now, one of the many interesting wrinkles of Michael's particular life is that he has been dealing with Parkinson's disease over the last decade or so, and that Parkinson's is always a reality for him. We discussed that in depth in about the latter third of the show, but it very rarely affected the actual talk. As you're going to hear, he has fought this really valiant fight to deal with this, and he has challenges that he talks about, but in a lot of major ways, he's won. He's tried just about every mainstream therapy, including stem cell therapy, with varying degrees of success with all of it, and we talk about that a bit here on the chat, and then also in the book he details it. So if you or someone you love is dealing with Parkinson's, you might especially be interested in that portion of both our talk, as well as in his book, where he gets into a lot of detail about this. But something that's very interesting and somewhat controversial, to say the least, but I loved having this conversation, is that ayahuasca seems to have had the most profoundly positive effect, for Michael at least, on his mental health as well as seemingly his physical health. And his discussion of that with me is something that I am extremely happy to share with you. He details this in the book in a way that really kind of blew my mind, detailing his journey on that plant medicine in the jungles of Peru and his journey to getting there in the first place and what that meant for him and how it was basically the hardest thing he's ever done in his life, but then the most profoundly satisfying. And ayahuasca has become a bit of a trendy experience for people in various circles around the world. Frankly, I've never done it, as I discuss. It's not something that people should approach, from my understanding, as, like a casual or party experience. It's definitely not that. So lest anyone think that I'm promoting something to get the kids in trouble, no one probably under 50 should even approach it, from my understanding. But again, I'm not one to judge, and Michael speaks very well for himself, so I'm going to let him do that in just a second. The last thing that I want to say before we get started is my take on this. My takeaway is that from his artistic pursuits to business to his more serious spiritual journey, Michael has thrown himself into more high-wire experiences than most people could ever conceive of, much less undertake. This is one of my favorite conversations ever, not just in front of a mic, but with another human being, and I'm very honored to bring it to you. You can check out the show notes for links and such, but for now, please enjoy my interview with Michael Wiese. Michael Wiese, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm really glad to have you here with me. And first of all, thank you for spending part of what I hope is a very happy birthday here with us today.
Oh, I hope so. I hadn't anything planned today except this, so I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, my traditional first question with this show is, how do you introduce yourself to people who you would like to know better, or you would like them to know you a little bit better?
I thought that was the toughest question of any that you presented. It made me think, I present myself with body language rather than trying to tell somebody about something, but I perceive myself as an enabler. So I don't think of myself so much as a filmmaker, a publisher, all those are really useful labels. I think more of myself as an enabler, helping people get things done and manifest. So that's probably the answer to that question.
I think that's a great answer. Now, we started, talking about doing this interview a while ago, and I have read your autobiography, Onward and Upward, which really enjoyed. And even as much as I sort of thought that I was familiar with some of your story, I, of course, sort of had my mind blown is what I was telling you kind of off mic of doing this. And your story is so extensive that I've done my best to come up with a way that we could hit some of the highlights of the earlier days, but really get into the meat of the later part of this. Now, I know that you were raised up as a boy in Champaign, Illinois, but given who you've become, who you are now, what or where do you consider to be the most meaningful part of your roots? Where do you think the most formative experiences happened for you?
Well, I probably would have a different answer if you asked me this 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Because I was thinking about this question. I think a major influence came from my grandfather, who I didn't really know very well. I think he died when I was 6. But I heard stories about him, and I noticed that I'm doing a lot of things, perhaps fulfilling his legacy in what I've been doing in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So he owned an art theater. He was one of the first to invest in building a theater in Champaign, it was later called the Art Theater. Mm-hmm. And so I had theatrical exhibition in my background, if you will. And he also was a bit of a philanthropist. I don't really know what that means in terms of scale, but I used to hear stories about him paying the tuition for students, foreign students that were going to the University of Illinois. And so that was always impressed me and wanted to be something that I would live up to in some way or contribute in some way. So these were little things that were never talked about, but that emerged. And if I had to put a name to it, or hook a family name to it, that's what I could come up with.
You said that you probably would have given me a different answer if I'd asked you 20 years ago. What do you think you might have said, then?
Well, I wouldn't have said, I don't think my grandfather would have come to mind. I don't think I was conscious enough. I hadn't done enough digging in that area to see these things. I think writing the book and some of the other film work I've done helped me, see the underlying energies and tensions that were kind of creating my myth and my story and my work.
Well, this is something that, when I was getting ready to talk with you, I realized, I wrote down a bunch of different questions, and I realized we could easily spend hours focused on just any one sort of era of your life, whether it's the 1960s in San Francisco or your original journeys to and throughout the East, which started back in the 70s. So, I basically have a million questions, and I want to touch on as many things as we can without keeping you on the call for 5 hours on your birthday. So let me get to it this way. What do you think is maybe the biggest lesson, or a few of the biggest lessons you learned, or the most impactful experiences you had in, say, the 1960s? We'll kind of start there, and we'll touch on the 70s before we kind of get into the more modern era.
I think I had gone to photography school in Rochester, New York, in the East Coast, and ended up in San Francisco. And the first day of class, photography, all the students put their work up on the wall, pinned them up there. And my work was very technically, perfect. The grayscales were all right, were right. It was in focus. There was no fuzz on the gate when printing it. But the content was really weak compared to the other students. I mean, I had nothing to say. I had no vision. And after class, the instructor indicated he used to, come over to my house. I want to show you something.
Uh-huh.
So he handed me this sugar cube.
Right. There's a lot in that little cube, as it turns out, right?
And need I say more?
We might have to explain a little bit for the kids at home, but yes, this would be your first deep trip into the inner realms. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. So everything was changed after that. My work improved in my different quests, for consciousness or spiritual growth or artistic proficiency. All these things were influenced by that one event. I think Steve Jobs will tell you the same thing. I think it's in his.
I remember reading that, in the book on him that came out a few years back.
I just think that it was a very valuable tool, a very valuable experience, and it's a shame that the whole thing went kind of belly up for the next couple of decades, and it's only now regaining its kind of relevancy.
Well, this is something that, I mean, I'm 51, and so I came to my own knowledge of that era, and I started reading guys like Krishnamurti when I was pretty young, but, before I began to understand it. But as I got into my own quest for, into esoteric philosophy and Eastern philosophy, I couldn't help but be overwhelmed with feeling like we really missed the boat, because I was coming to this stuff in the 80s. So in your case, you had this experience at really sort of the apex of that in the late 60s, early 70s. And then you had your artistic roots. I'll refer people to your book to really dig into the details of that, because there's so much that we could say. And I know you've talked about some of this in other places, but you started going to the East. And so was that initial trip, that switch that got flipped, do you think that helped propel you out of the West and into the East? And what do you think you were looking for when you initially set off?
Well, I think I sort of threw myself into the river to see where I would end up. A lot of students and young people were going through India, through Europe to get to India. And I went the other way, and there were fewer travelers. The reason I went it seems funny now, but I had made a film and I wanted to be Bergman's apprentice, Ingmar Bergman's apprentice, his films. And I said in my film, and said, I want to be your apprentice. If I don't hear from you in 3 weeks, I'll go to Japan and study with Kurosawa. And of course, he didn't write me back, and I think he wanted me to go to Japan, that my sensibilities would be awakened there. And so I went to Japan, knowing one person, or having corresponded with one person, a Japanese avant-garde animator who worked with Yoko Ono, and he took me under his wing. The first few weeks I was in Japan, and I spent about a year there the first trip, and I had no desire to travel up to that point. But Japan was such an awakening and such a different way of life, and then I traveled throughout Southeast Asia and Bali and Java and India and Nepal, and anyway, a lot of different places after that.
And I know that you came to view Bali as a place. I mean, you mentioned how many dozens and dozens of times you've been there and how much time you spent. What did it represent to you as you were getting to know of it, and sort of how do you think of it, now looking back as the world has changed so much?
Well, I always get heartbroken when I go back to Bali and see what's changed, and I try not to dwell on it too much. There's a whole new generation, building villas and teaching yoga classes. And I went and lived in a remote village and studied gamelan music. I'd been a drummer, and gamelan was like an orchestra full of drummers. And that was the music that got me to go to Bali in the first place. It was so transcendental and took me to other realms. And I thought, wow, this music is so extraordinary. I've got to find out about it. Mm-hmm. It's unlike Western music, which it tends to be a soloist that steps out, and when it's rock and roll with a lead guitarist or jazz. But with Balinese music, it's all interlocking patterns, and it's dependent. The whole thing is dependent on this precise interlocking of notes. So one player might go, these are a whole orchestra of xylophones and drums, and the instruments are tuned out of tune just a hair, so you get a little buzz.
Okay.
From that
little dissonance between them.
Yeah.
A little stereo spread built into the design of the instruments.
Exactly. And so one player will play and the other one will play and together it's and then gongs come in over every 16 beats, bong, huge gong, which carries you through. And then on the top are a couple of flutes, also slightly detuned, playing an eerie kind of snake-like interweaving. Mm-hmm. And then this is all the background, sonic background for trance dancing and mask dances and cleansing rituals. And so it's a pretty amazing culture. And to step into that was very profound, and it drew me back again and again and again.
How long were you in really that headspace of being in sort of a, living and working within a fairly transcendental type of a community? I was going to ask, what was the longest period you spent sort of in that world?
Well, I don't know, a little less than a year. A pretty good hunk of time, because there wasn't, living in a village. I didn't go into the town very often except to stock up on coffee and sugar and bring it back to the village. And it was a very intensive time. It was like a training or initiation. I've published a couple of books having to do with Bali. One is a book called Mandalas of Bali, which was done by my host, the guy, the head of the village, who put me up in a little hut and looked after me, really. Mm-hmm. I think I was 22 years old at the time, something like that. And so I published his book of paintings. He started a painting community. And then I did a film a couple of years ago called Talking with Spirits, which is about trance channeling and other dimensions that the Balinese are very comfortable with and familiar with. And, they spend half their time in spiritual pursuits. And so it's very rich in that regard. But that's changing very, very quickly.
Are those, modernization and whatnot are pushing those indigenous communities to the fringe? Do you see them disappearing altogether, or are they holding fast sort of in remote areas?
Well, I like to tell myself they're holding fast, but I met with a friend who spent a lot of time in Bali last week, and he was telling me that one of our friends, who's the best shadow puppeteer in Bali, would perform something like 300 nights out of the year, and there'd be 300 people in the audience. And nowadays, there's probably an audience of 30, and most of the people leave before it's over because they have jobs where they have to earn money to pay for their mortgages on their motorcycles.
Wow.
Which are new.
Huh.
And it's just, it's something that's important as a shadow play to convey culture and knowledge and, insight. It's just sad to see that being displaced by motorcycles and cell phones, and the attention is going somewhere else.
Right. Well, this actually brings me to, I think we'll end up talking about that type of thing a lot before we're done here. And I want to move through another significant part of your work life. And it reflects back on what you just said. You had really great success in the 80s video era. First as a vice president at Vestron Video. And I know you also worked creating political campaign content. So basically you really learned how the sausage was made. And in your book, you write about losing some illusions in the process of that. In particular, you wrote something that struck me about how being seen by others as a suit when you're an executive really caused cognitive dissonance for you, since you'd always seen yourself as an artist or a seeker. So I'm wondering, when this was happening back in the 80s, how did you reconcile that within yourself? And then how did that inform what you did next, which I guess ultimately led to the book company being, growing?
Well, all of these things kind of overlapped. There's no, it'd be hard to date them,
Right.
Say one thing led specifically to something else. But, it was very heavy working at Vestron and having enormous resources and being responsible for hundreds of titles, comedy titles, Robin Williams, Billy Crystal, Whoopi Goldberg, documentaries, National Geographic, Nova Smithsonian, children's, all these different genres I got to package, co-produce, and just see how I could try things, and they would usually be successful because the shelves were still not full, and people at home wanted more choices with video. Mm-hmm. So we were the largest independent company with 500 employees, and so that was great doing that, and I learned a lot that I used to create the book business. But I started the book business before I was at Vestron. Right. I think I'd written 3 books before then, and was doing the self-publishing thing kind of on the side. But these weren't spiritual endeavors. These were books about how to make independent films and market them. And so what I was learning from the real life experience of being in the video business, I could apply to the book business. Mm-hmm. And I think I just saw the irony of it is that, what we were doing was just would end up in landfills in a few years later.
Right.
And I just said, I want to do something that makes a difference and not just feed the beast. And so Vestron got into some hard times, lost their line of credit, and the whole thing shut down. Mm-hmm. So then I had an opportunity to go back into the corporate video world. I was offered various jobs with studios and larger distributors, and I consulted with some of these people for a year or so while I thought about how I would put things together again. And I moved from the East Coast back to California, mm-hmm. and started slowly. And my whole approach to this has been to sort of plod carefully along and not make too many mistakes. And mm-hmm. and so, I had done spiritually oriented films before I went to the East Coast. I was in San Francisco, so I did some things with Esalen and a lot of the consciousness, human potential people that were out there at the time. My first investor was Michael Murphy of Esalen.
Right.
Esalen was a huge human potential center where all the greats, Fritz Perls and Joseph Campbell and anybody you could name taught there or
right.
on workshops or seminars.
Right. Krishnamurti was there, and one of my early show guests on this podcast is a mentor and friend in Hollywood and in life, Carl Bressler, and he's Esalen is his spiritual home. He's made many trips there. He sees that as sort of the grounding place in his life. So I have not been, but I've heard an awful lot about it secondhand, and I feel like I need to.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. I ended up there drumming for the Big Sur Folk Festival. Mm-hmm. 1 year, and the next year I was there as a cameraman shooting a film called Celebration at Big Sur. So I had a number of different connections, and it seemed like the world was smaller then because I was able to be involved with many different overlapping scenes, mm-hmm. from the Midnight Movie series that we started, lasted for a couple of years, to the band I played in, to my own film work. So I managed to spin a lot of plates at the same time. And these things have an effect. Over time, you look back and you see that things that you did were involved with, that we're history. That we're making history, but we didn't really realize it at the time.
What was the first with Michael Wiese Productions, with your publishing division? And I've spoken about this. I've been happy to have a few of your authors on recently. I have a few more coming up actually. And I mentioned in the interview with Stephen Katz how his book, Film Directing Shot by Shot, that I was in film school when that book was published. And I remember my professor coming in very excitedly, with that book, because he had been drawing these things, illustrations on the board to explain how different shots work. And all of a sudden someone publishes it in a book for the first time, really so cleanly and clearly. And that became a textbook, the next term. And so that's one of the ones. And of course, your budgeting book was actually also on the shelf. What was the initial, was that Katz book the first one was that the first really big hit, or what do you think, what really helped put the company on the map back in the day?
Well, Shot by Shot was probably the sixth book. I think I wrote 3 of them and then realized I didn't know enough and had to get other people to write books for us. And so Steve Katz was probably 5th or 6th or somewhere there. When I started the company, there was no category of filmmaking or screenwriting. Mm-hmm. There may have been 1 or 2 other books out there, but it was unaddressed, and all this information was kind of secretly held by Hollywood. And
right,
you could learn it if you went to work as an assistant cameraman or assistant editor, but it was pretty much kept under wraps. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to learn myself all the many things about filmmaking that would empower me. And so Shot by Shot, it was many years before it really had a foothold and was known. Now we've just crossed the 26th year, I think, anniversary of Shot by Shot, and it's in something like, 17 languages.
Yeah.
In fact, we just heard about a year ago that from our Chinese agent, we've sold about 90 books to the Chinese to be translated in, Mm-hmm. So and he said something like, there has been no greater influence on Chinese filmmaking than MWP books.
I believe it.
Just,
yeah. I've seen them here in the stores. I've seen them, the Chinese versions of them here in the stores, which has been really, having grown up on them, it's been really cool. I imagine it makes you feel pretty incredible to have that kind of a reach.
It does, and it was unexpected, and we were working to get into China in bigger ways, but we weren't kind of paying attention to the big picture. We were just plodding along, releasing book after book and making our little deals. And I mean, that didn't happen overnight. That was about 11 years since we've been doing it. But it's like if you plant seeds in your backyard and you forget about them, and next time you go out, you see that there's a big oak tree there, and that's kind of what's happened with a lot of the things that I participated in. We tend to think of the moment and not how this is going to affect history or mm-hmm. The future generations. And so anyway, that was great to hear that we were well thought of in China.
Absolutely. And in the introduction to this show today that you haven't heard as we're having the conversation, I actually quoted the MWP mission statement that's in the back of your books. And so I want to ask you about that, specifically this notion of being a light bringer through your work. And I could make some guesses, but I have you here, so I should ask you, when did that really clarify itself to you as a mandate for your work and your life, and how did that sort of change your approach to living in the world of being a light bringer and trying to illuminate that which was hidden before?
Well, that's always been part of what I do, or what I've strived to do or address. I think that the hard thing about being in the corporate world was that there was no acknowledgement of the spiritual dimension of life, and as you get older, it becomes more and more important. And the world is not one-dimensional by any means. We can talk about this later. But,
yeah, we definitely want to talk about that.
So, let's see. When I was 1978, I worked on a film, Dorothy Fadiman, called, first of all, it's called Do Saints Really Glow? And then we retitled it and re-edited it, and it's called Radiance, the Experience of Light. And that looks at the experience of light as, as it occurred to many of the spiritual masters over time. And, the question is, do these guys really light up, or is this a metaphor for higher consciousness? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is that you learn as you go through as you watch the film, is that both are true.
Right. Yes, is the answer to the question, I would think. Is when I read that in your book, is Dorothy Fadiman, that's not a very common name. Is she related to James Fadiman, the psychedelic researcher?
Yep. Yeah, she was on the cover with Jim of Look magazine back in the 60s.
Were they husband and wife, or?
They have an open marriage, which they're very pleased to share with anybody. So they were an experimental lifestyle going.
Oh, I see. But they were a parallel couple, I guess, is what I'm trying. I'm trying to carbon date them, that they were. She was doing her research at the same time that he was doing his research, basically.
Yeah, well, it's all, everybody was, working one way or another. Everybody else, Michael Murphy, the Esalen co-founder, introduced me to Dorothy, and I met Jim. Jim was out here last year.
Oh, out in
so we're
Cornwall.
Still in very much. Yeah, we're still very good friends.
I have, but he's been popping up in a lot of conversations lately, and different things I'm reading and different people in interviews. I think it's interesting, and I guess we're sort of getting into that realm a bit. I want to ask you, and again, please interject or grab the wheel if you feel like I'm paying short shrift. There's just so much to talk about that I want to sort of seed some things. You detail in the book. This seems like a bit of a topic shift, but it's going to lead us back to consciousness. In the book, you talk about how the diagnosis you received of having Parkinson's disease has impacted your life. And so on a more, if I could use the word mundane without it being a loaded term, on a more mundane level, how do you approach dealing with the challenges and adversity of that diagnosis? How have you changed how has that changed your perspective on dealing with challenges? And then I'd like to talk, of course, we'll talk about the plant therapies from that point forward. But how did that change your perception of what a challenge was and how you dealt with things?
Well, it was a shock, first off, to be diagnosed with Parkinson's, and of course the first thing that anybody does is rushes to YouTube and looks at all the people shaking and having a miserable time and
right.
degrading. And so I looked at that, and that scared me. And then as I worked with it, I said, well, I got to do something. It was a call to arms. Mm-hmm. I came to the point where don't believe anybody else's stories. It's time for you to work on your own body, mind, consciousness, and get yourself out of this mess. It's like, you got it. You created it. Now, get rid of it. And that has led to an amazing journey all over the world in all kinds of different indigenous and scientific environments to work with treating it or reducing symptoms. And I had a number of breakthroughs on that journey. Mm-hmm. Also, a number of things that didn't work. It's amazing how much you can learn by what doesn't work, things that you try, films that you try to make and they fall apart. You learn something. You get Parkinson's, there's plenty to learn in trying to heal yourself. So I met this martial artist who has this program in Israel. It kind of combines martial arts, behavior modification, jazz, and dance. Mm-hmm. And I worked with him for I don't remember how many times we went to Israel, about 6 times, maybe 5 times. And that helped significantly. And he, when I went to see him, I shuffled in, a little old man shuffling in, and a few hours later I came out, I was dancing.
Wow. It was that fast.
So, huh? Yeah, I mean, he just, part of it is because he refused to let me leave until he changed my mindset and the way I was holding my illness.
Okay.
And so, I'm at the point where I'm a healthy person with Parkinson's.
Right.
I was saying to my wife this morning, I said, I can't believe it's been 11 or 12 years that I've had the Parkinson's. Because that's a long time, but
sure,
I've managed to do things. We published a book called Goodbye Parkinson's, Hello Life.
Right.
And that's by my Israeli teacher, Alex Curtin. And so what I tend to do is, something's in my past, I usually make a film about it or a book about it.
I like that approach. That seems to have served you really well, and I think I'm going to apply this in my own life a little bit more. This is something that I'm taking away from your story. I know.
But whatever shows up is because you need it to show up and deal with it. And I found a way to maybe control it or maintain it or come at it from a different angles. If I treat it more like a game.
Right.
And I'm writing a book on Parkinson's, my journey with it, or how people not so much my journey, but things that people can try. And, because everybody's situation is different. Their symptoms are different. And, some people just give up.
Right.
And other people are real Parkinson's warriors and really fight the fight.
Well, this isn't even on my list of prep questions because, again, there's so many things that we could talk about. But as you're mentioning that you approached it like a game, of course, I think of game theory, and I think of the world game, which was created and popularized by Bucky Fuller, who is a massive part of your life, and I would say vice versa.
It's his birthday today, too. Today is his birthday.
That's what I was getting at, because I remember that you two share a birthday, and I've got to know what are a handful. This will be a little bit of a non sequitur because we're going to come back and talk about Mother Ayahuasca. But while we're on the subject, since I grabbed the wheel with this left turn, when you reflect back on the impact of Bucky Fuller, what are the things you think of most fondly? And he was so far ahead of his time, and in my idealistic youth, I was really hoping that a lot of his theories would be put into practice, and we live in a very different world as a result of that not being the case. But what are the things that stick with you the most about him when you think about him?
Well, Bucky, you can't say enough about the man. He's I spent several years getting in a position where I could work with him and work on films about him, and I did a book with him and a little book. But just to be around him is just mind blowing. He is extraordinary. There's not a week or a month that go by where I don't think about him or something he said that kind of fits in, makes sense. What I think about lately is that he always says, start with universe. Mm-hmm. And we're so we're kind of looking at the wrong end of the telescope, and things seem very far away. But if you feel yourself as part of the universe, which we are, mm-hmm. We don't, our bodies don't end at our skin; they go out into the universe, mm-hmm. And everything affects everything else, and everything is interconnected. And so, Bucky's models and his geometry uses the principles that are found in this dimension and in many other dimensions. I mean, Bucky is so ripe for a rediscovery in this by this generation. We've got to catch up with Bucky. He was really out there.
Well,
he would draw. Yeah. He would draw on the tablecloth to try to teach me synergetic mathematics, and I didn't really get it. And every couple of years, I open up synergetics and try to, learn something more from it.
Yeah, I'm still working on synergetics. I mean, I've read all the words before, but I need to revisit it. I should probably try to reread that every decade. He has his books that are more accessible. That is not one of them, I would say. to invoke Stephen Katz again, actually, that book is the book that his film directing shot by shot is the book that I have most gifted to aspiring filmmaker friends, or most referred. But in terms of general purpose book, the book that I have most gifted to people is Critical Path by Bucky Fuller. And I'm doing probably a fairly terrible job of trying to impress on anyone who isn't familiar with the man why they should care. But I'll see if I can find some good links to include in our show notes to get people on path. We need someone smarter than me to take up the mantle of that cause, but I will be the biggest cheerleader, in their work if they can bring him back to prominence and look at him in light of the current world situation.
There's some good some lectures online, Bucky, that you can watch. Some are very good.
Well, you mentioned him, and actually, that wasn't so much of a tangent as another layer to this same train of thought, which is, Bucky spoke of, again, the micro is in the macro and vice versa. And the reality, the journey that you took, I mean, when sorting out, when confronted with this diagnosis, and the book you detail it pretty exhaustively, including what you just mentioned with your martial arts, dancing type of shamanic journey and stem cell therapy and things. But this ultimately led you to the jungles of Peru and ayahuasca. So for most people are non-experiencers, including myself. I have many friends who are familiar with that. But can you, for the sake of non-experiencers, can you talk about ayahuasca and how it's helped you and what you've learned from the plant?
That's a very, very rich and loaded question.
Take it how you will. That was the goal. I basically want you to talk, and I'm just going to listen.
Well, we'll step back a foot and just, we were last talking about Bucky and his multi-dimensional universes, and he maps out these mathematical models that take us into other dimensions and realities. But I never knew. I thought that was all on paper mathematics theory.
The multiverse, right?
Multiverse. And when I experienced ayahuasca, it's a real place that you can go. It's a place we live. Actually, we don't have to go anywhere. It's going on right now all around us and through us. And so I learned about ayahuasca because I was looking for some cure for Parkinson's. And I found this study that was done in the 1920s or 30s, I don't remember now, that talked about Banisteriopsis, which is the vine part of the brew that was used for Parkinson's with some success. So that put me on this journey to find a place where I could try ayahuasca. But I wasn't expecting. I mean, what was I saying this? I wasn't too excited about taking any psychedelics because I'd done that in the 60s, and I saw the downside to that.
Sure.
So I had an old model of what that meant. But when I was in the tea room of the Jokan Temple in Lhasa, a friend of mine came up and said, I'm bringing this Peruvian shaman, curandero, to put on some ceremonies, and this might interest you. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm doing my Buddhist thing now. I want to be pure. I don't want to take any mess up the meditation with. And the more I thought about it and heard about this man, Don Jose Campos, I decided I would do it. And my wife joined me, and we went to Peru and met Don Jose, and he was just this open, jovial, wonderful guy. And we trusted him, as you have to do, because the ayahuasca journey is a hard one, and you want somebody to take you through it, and you don't want to be left in the jungle to sort it out yourself. So I did some ceremonies, and it completely turned my worldview inside out and upside down. And I saw that I was wrong about everything. That I didn't know how the world worked, or I didn't know my place in it. I didn't, but that became very clear to me when I was in the experience and watching these entities show up. I mean, mythological creatures show up, and they could be teachers, and so I would always ask them, "Are you a teacher?" Mm-hmm. And pursue dialogue with them if I could. Some seem very excited to see us kind of break through into their realm. It's like we pop up, and it's like it's kind of like Men in Black. It's a poor man's version of an ayahuasca journey or Avatar. Avatar is the first kind of ayahuasca movie that I've seen. But so the main thing it taught me, many things, is that we're all connected in everything we do, and our survival depends upon the survival of everything. And if we would just get this through our heads, we'd realize that every time we spill oil, we're poisoning all of us. Mm-hmm. And every time we clean up a stream, we're providing drinking water for us. And that the whole thing is vast and a mystery, and you really can't talk about it because language is too limited to convey. I did the best I could in the book.
Yeah, and it's your what the kids call trip reports are very vivid. The letter that you shared, a letter that you wrote to friends detailing the experience, and so again, I'm going to really recommend that people check this out in your book if they're interested for the detailed version, because you paint an extraordinarily vivid picture, but I'm sure that it can't contain the experience you describe in the first journey, of it being basically a very and literally gut-wrenching 12-hour process, and you're undertaking this while you are dealing with a physical challenge anyway, and you're dealing with something that's physically grueling. So it changed your view. You feel like you understand the world in a different way. Something that really struck me, and I can't do justice to it by summarizing it here, but you describe an event with your wife and her mother's passing and how they were connected and shared that experience. And that to be true, like in the way it's described, it's very, I understand that this is reality. What are some other things that to be true in your gut, right? It's things that you've learned maybe since that time, more recent years, or even yesterday. What's something or some things that are true internally, but that maybe haven't been publicly proven yet, but that, hopefully or possibly will be?
Well, my wife's experiences are similar, but also very different from mine. She sees. I don't want to talk about what her experience is, but I would like to see more ancestors and beings that have, been in this reality, in this realm before. Mm. And so it didn't happen to me until about the 6th or 7th journey, and a couple of friends of mine showed up, and I was able to communicate briefly with them, kind of across the well, nothing dies. That's one thing. It just keeps, except in my experience, I died over and over and over, and I kept saying, this is interesting because I keep coming back.
Right.
And then I realized that I do keep coming back. That's part of the nature of things. And so I was, I saw these two friends of mine, and that was pretty, but just about everything that I saw was a new take on reality. It's a very intense, first off, you're nauseous. I was nauseous for maybe half the time. And it's like I'd say it's the hardest thing that I've ever done, and the most valuable thing I've ever done, because of its teaching. The first journey I did, it was so hard. I said to my wife, I'm not going to do this anymore. Right. Let's go home. And because I got into a very paranoid space, and But as I thought about it, I realized it was one of the most powerful moments of my life. And how was I going to walk away from like the greatest teacher I'd ever met? So I went to Don Jose and said, "No, I'll stay signed up for tonight. I'll go again." Mm-hmm. And then I had a very gentle journey. And it's unpredictable what will happen, and it's always different.
Have you continued to revisit that experience? You mentioned that you mentioned later experiences, which are, post the book publication, for instance, where you felt like you were able to communicate with friends. Do you feel like it's an ongoing part of therapy to revisit it at a certain point?
Well, I visit it all the time. I'm sitting here in front of our cottage, and there are all these flowers and plants, and the garden is a land of sacred geometry, and it's like I'm inside Bucky's book when I walk through the garden. And I didn't pay much attention to plants and gardens, 10 years ago, and now we can't get enough of flowers and plants. And I mean, it's just extraordinary, this miracle we're living in. And so, what I'm trying to do with the books and the events, and all I'm trying to, and the Parkinson's people, is to just bring that awareness front and foremost, because everything has consciousness, and so we can learn from all of it.
Speaking of helping other people who deal with Parkinson's, do you find that there is growing acceptance of this particular modality or alternative modalities for dealing with it? Do you detect or sense or know of an opening up to this, or is it still draconian, big pharma controlling everything?
It's not even. I get half a dozen phone calls a year about people wanting to know about ayahuasca and Parkinson's, and I've met 2 or 3 other people who've used ayahuasca in their healing process too. But it's not, it's not widespread. Nobody would know. And I can't, if I go to these Parkinson's group to talk about it, they're not even to the point of recognizing their own participation in their illness, and they want to hear me talk about plants have consciousness, and we
right.
live in dimensional universes, and that's not going to go down. I mean, it's in fact, probably half of your audience has turned their radios off.
I was just going to say we lost everybody who's not like a head has already tuned out about 25 minutes ago, but that's okay because this show is for the people that it's for. And actually, I suspect most people listening to this are right there with us. Those people who you mentioned, who you have met, the small handful of people you've met, do you know if at least anecdotally they felt like it helped them?
No, I didn't get enough data. It's all very new.
Well, speaking of new, let's shift into something. Maybe it's a continuation of this same thread, or maybe it's a radical turn. But speaking of the new and what you're working on these days, and what are some of the current issues or trends you're following, whether it's professional, philosophical, spiritual? What has your interest the most these days?
Well, I'm working on my Parkinson's regime, my day-to-day, what I do, which involves healing modalities and Tai Chi and meditation and reading and studying, and it's not. I don't really follow trends, because I somehow find myself, on the front end of the curve every time. So I trust that what I'm supposed to do, I will be shown it, and the people and the resources will show up. In fact, that's what happened after ayahuasca. It's like things started happening very quickly. Synchronicity was in full force. Bucky says if you have synchronetic events, then you're on the right path.
Right.
So things show up for me, and it's like I have an abundant choice of things I can get involved with, and I'm actually trying to do less than more. There's been 300 videos, and about the same number of books that have gone, I've touched in one way or participated in one way, and it's like I don't need more projects.
True. Fair enough. Fair enough. No, you have your output is prodigious by anybody's measure. So, who or what do you credit the most for helping equip you to successfully approach life?
Oh, there have been dozens of people, known and well known and unknown. Everybody has. I go back to Michael Murphy, and he gave me $3,000 to do my first. He's my first investor to do a film on sports consciousness. And what happened was I did the film, but what changed was I felt I could be supported for my film work.
Right.
And he knew this by nudging me and giving me giving me something tangible that I could put to good use. So, in paying him back, I try to find other young people who are just at the beginning of their careers that if I can support one way or another, I will. So, and I think everybody has consciously or unconsciously contributed to my growth. I mean, I said, I'm working on another film book. It's going to be very short, I hope, but I'm going to do a section on mentors. So I'd have Bucky in there and a number of other people that were important to me, just to try to let people know that, look, you can, you can learn anything you want. These people are willing to, at a very high level, share with you and teach you and nurture you along, and you needn't be afraid.
Well, and you've done that by sitting here and talking with me for an hour. So I couldn't appreciate it more, both through the work that you've put out there and then taking the time like this. What is, as we sort of wrap it up, because I want to let you enjoy the rest of your day in what I assume is a beautiful day in Cornwall, what is maybe the best question that I should have asked you but didn't? Is there something that occurs to you that you would like to share? Basically, it's kind of an open-ended guest's choice for closing thoughts.
No, not really. I would. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Okay.
After you hang up and you realize, oh my gosh, I wish I would have asked him that.
Right.
What's the that?
Okay. Here's the question. Is there one great? Is there an overarching insight that controls your day-to-day experience? I mean, everything is connected, I think would probably be the foundational one, but is there anything that is right there for the seeing or the understanding or the taking that you feel people just somehow miss?
Yeah. I mean, I this morning, my wife and I went out on the patio here, and the light was hitting a leaf that had 3 or 4 drops of water on it, and each drop of water looked like a planet, like a crystal planet.
Uh-huh.
It's very small. I took some pictures of it, and that's a miracle. Mm-hmm. It's profoundly beautiful, and the fact that we can see it and be excited about it it's a very profound moment. And this stuff is going on all the time. I mean, ayahuasca just turns up the volume, and so you can break through. And people ask, well, how do I get enlightened? Well, you already are enlightened. It's all the conditions for enlightenment are all around you. You don't have to go to Tibet. You don't even have to go outside where you're sitting right now. The consciousness inhabits everything, and it's like our job is to kind of like be a Mars rover. I think where they crawl over the planet collecting information.
Right. And
you don't even have to be, quote, successful to fulfill your life's purpose, because you already are. You exist, and you're taking in with your senses all this information. And some people can articulate it better than others and need to articulate. Other people don't need to say anything about it at all. They just live it. Mm-hmm. I have a friend who is no longer with us, but he's a really great friend. And he worked for a newspaper in the classified ad section part-time. And he lived in a tiny little apartment. And he didn't have to earn much money. But he was the most contented person I'd ever known. Mm-hmm. And he'd simplified his life, and he translated poetry, and I mean, he was just a remarkable guy. And he had found that place, and you could feel it just being around him. So I guess what I'm trying to do is suggest to people they not worry so much about, whether they're going to get enlightened or not, or whether that's even a worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I created this show to have these kind of conversations. If we lost anybody, that's their loss, frankly. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, yeah, it's great what you're doing. You're opening a window into many, many worlds, and by the guests that you have on, and by your own study and your own research, and it's been very rewarding to be part of your show, and to be very honored to be asked to do this.
Well, thank you.
So now go in the editing room and clean this up and make it work.
Make it sound like geniuses. Well, you already are. Thank you so much. We'll have to do a round 2.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
All right, that's the show this week. I hope you enjoyed that chat with Michael Wiese. Please visit crazyinagoodway.com to learn more about the show, to find the links of things that we talked about here in the interview, and also to contact me if you wish. There's a contact form on the website. And please subscribe to the show, share it with friends. I really appreciate you listening. Thanks again for listening. I'm Brendan Davis, and I'll see you next week.